Welcome back to the Cast of Us, an untitled HBO The Last of Us podcast for episode 5, Endure and Survive, directed by Jeremy Webb and written by Craig Mazin. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck, alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
I was just checking my Chris Gain and just turning it up a little bit and ready
Love
to
it, love
go.
it.
We're a little late on this one, Matt,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
understandably so. You just got back from vacation, and I'm slowly
They
starting
pulled
to
a fast
recover
one
from
on
the
us, Eric.
sickness. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
you,
yeah, this is the Super Bowl's fault, basically. This is what we're
Yeah,
coming down
yeah.
to.
So here's the thing, everyone. We appreciate you if you are listening or watching this right before probably episode 6, because we're doing a double episode, a Super Sunday on February 19th. We're doing
Sunday?
episode we're doing episode 5, not in one episode, but we're gonna do this episode 5, which covers last week's episode. We are a week late. But then we will have episode 6 up at our normal time, which is 10 p.m. Eastern. Right after HBO's The Last of Us airs on podcast services and YouTube, one stop shop on Letterboxd, Untitled_movies. Yeah, we're a little bit late. I was on vacation. We pre-recorded one episode, and we're like, you know what? I get home on Sunday. We can record Sunday afternoon, and we'll have it up at our regular time at 10 p.m. Eastern. And then midway through my vacation, it was announced that HBO was putting up the episode early on HBO Max because of the Super Bowl. So it aired on Friday if you have HBO Max or Crave here in Canada, and then it aired on linear TV on HBO on Sunday night during the Super Bowl. So we did miss that, and then due to some, Eric's getting over cordyceps, I'm dealing with my own cordyceps in my leg. There's just different things going on this week that we got a little bit delayed with everything. So double episode Sunday, we're covering episode 5, Endure and Survive, right now on this episode, and then we'll have a brand new episode for episode 6, Kin, which will drop at 10 p.m. Eastern on February 19th. So as you're listening to this, it's either already up or it's going to be up in a few hours. Eric, that being said, it's nice to be home. I'm excited to talk Last of Us again. It's been a little too long. I've watched these episodes now, I feel like 3-4 times each. So I'm excited to kind of talk about this.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you have to kind of go back to them. One way it's intriguing because again we've talked about that first watch being incomplete to a certain degree with the effects, and then when you go
Yeah.
back and rewatch some of them when they've been updated, and then you see the final version, it is very fulfilling in knowing that okay, this is you've seen the before and after of something.
That's kind of been fun, yeah, because this episode especially probably has the most special effects and has the biggest kind of action sequence of the whole season. So that first version we saw was a little rough around the edges with special effects, but it was nice to kind of see that final version. And this was one of the ones that I actually watched on Crave in like full 4K because it was already out by the time Nevis and I got home from vacation, and I watched it with her, and I can't wait to watch this series on 4K Blu-ray when HBO drops that, because I've been watching like piecemeal, the unfinished versions, our screeners with watermarks, and they're only 1080p. I've watched some episodes in 4K on Crave, so I'm excited to sit down once it's all over and it's released on 4K Blu-ray and just kind of power through it again, because it's a depressing ass show every week. I feel like I'm crying with my wife watching this, but it's definitely rewatchable because I've watched each episode now 2-3 times because we meticulously take notes to talk about it on this show. But I guess we'll just get right into it, man. How did you feel of episode 5 of The Last of Us?
Yeah, so basically, to sum this episode up, for every small victory, there's an even greater loss. Lamar Johnson and Kevon Montreal Woodard's resilient performances epitomize the unwavering devotion we have to the people closest to us.
Yeah, man. It's a great episode. Like I said, probably the biggest action set piece in the entire episode. I feel like it wonderfully wraps up Kathleen's story and Henry and Sam's story in like just two very tight episodes. I'm amazed at how much this show can it's so interesting because we talked about like a lot of the Disney stuff on Disney Plus, right? Like how there'll be 9 episodes or 6 episodes in a season of a Marvel thing, but I feel like single episodes in those feel like almost sometimes nothing happens, where I'm always amazed in The Last of Us, especially, like how much they can get through in just 2 episodes and how much depth they can give characters, how much backstory they can give characters, how you can have a complete kind of Henry and Sam's story basically in this just one episode, just like we had Bill and Frank's the other one, and you're heartbroken and ripped apart by the end, and you fall in love with these characters and then lose them, and it's just I'm so impressed with the show, and being a fan of the game, the differences which we'll go through when we do the step-by-step breakdown, but I the differences in the depth they give Henry and Sam's story with all of Kathleen's stuff in Kansas City, because that stuff's not in the game. So the more we get of that and that whole sequence with the sniper, which is very much from the game, but the way they twist that to have that kind of horde breakout from underground was
We
just
got a
absolutely
bloater.
wild. Yeah, and we got a bloater for the first time, right? So you're starting to see those different variations of the infected. It starts with the runners, then they turn into clickers, and then you get the bloaters, and then we'll get even maybe not even in this season but maybe next season the different variations. There's stalkers, and there's um something called the Rat King, but it's not that's in Last of Us 2 stuff. But like I just like seeing those different variations, and that bloater is absolutely brutal in this episode. And I think that whole action set piece, the little girl clicker, I think was fantastically done. And and then yeah, Henry and Sam just like absolutely tearing your heart out by the end of it. It just like, they changed a lot of that too. Like Sam in the game is not deaf. So that's completely different. But the nuts and bolts of that whole relationship is very similar to what it is in the game, of them going in the tunnels and seeing that underground kind of community that was there. There's a little hint at a character named Ish, which you learn about in the game through notes of what he was doing down there. And like, there's just so much world building and storytelling in these episodes. And I'm just like constantly, impressed with how they so faithfully adapt the game, but then completely subvert your expectations by adding all the Kathleen stuff, changing Pittsburgh to Kansas City, and making that all kind of work. So I just think it's another great episode. Another one where you're just like, I think each week is just not even a therapy session when people go and watch this, but I've cried like almost every week with my wife watching this show. And it's fun at times, but then also horribly depressing, but then hopeful at times. It goes back to that original question that you brought up, I think, right in our first review, is like, is this an optimistic show or a pessimistic show kind of thing, right? And it's, I think, a little bit of both. I stick with that, but I think the more characters we meet, the more characters that die, it becomes kind of pessimistic. But then everything Joel learns from these experiences, and Ellie as well, I think is that optimistic stuff, where each one of these guest stars have absolutely crushed their episodes and have done so much in the 1 or 2 episodes that they're in, and they all serve Joel and Ellie's story, right? Like, um, I talked to my wife and they're like, why do they always need to kill these characters off? And I go, I don't think they need to, but this is a very bleak world that all these characters live in, and you're very lucky if you don't die, right?
Right.
And I feel like, that loss that Joel and Ellie experiences through their journey across the United States, and like you can see in those moments that with Pedro Pascal's performance of, reading the note from Bill in the Bill and Frank episode, or in this moment, like the conversations he has with Henry in the underground, and when Henry reveals why he did what he did to try to save Sam and things like that, and the whole bad am I a bad guy conversation, and then losing them at the end, and with Henry having to shoot his own brother and then ultimately killing himself, is because he had nothing left after that, and he did this horrible thing, but he did it to protect Ellie, right? Like Henry didn't know that Ellie was or could be immune to the virus, so he to the fungus, so he has to shoot his own brother to protect Ellie, and he can't live with that, and he has nothing, and all of that I think serves Joel and Ellie's um story, while still telling you really deep and emotional stories from these side characters. So like I think that's always what constantly impresses me each week. So I think another fantastic episode. I don't know if you have anything to add, Eric, before we go into
Yeah,
this
it's a mirror reflection of those relationships and the duality of it. I think, like it's been talked about a lot, but you see in this episode specifically, there's always kind of this dual or two character play by play, a two hander with Joel and Ellie, and with Sam and Henry, and even Kathleen and Jeffrey Pierce's character. So there's a lot
original
there.
Tommy.
The original Tommy. So there's a lot going on there thematically, and the symmetry of it is interesting. And then to your point before, where there's a lot of groundwork being laid throughout this entire series, that the past, present, and future, narratively speaking, the connections there, and even just subtle hints that might pay off in a later episode, are so rewarding in how they fulfill a character's arc or give more insight to the world in which they live in. And even just looking at this episode and how it recontextualizes the last one, and how we
Mhm.
see this episode from the perspective, the last episode from the perspective of Henry and Sam. This is basically their episode, and they become Joel and Ellie for a moment, and the lead characters like Bill and Frank. So you're now seeing the last episode again repeat itself, but now from a new perspective. And
I
I
love
think
that too. Yeah.
with that, it kind of adds more to the last episode, because we were talking about this with that episode, where if you were to call any of these episodes filler, maybe that last episode kind of would be, because it's a lot of setup. But
Yeah.
now with the payoff
With the
of it,
payoff. Yeah.
you need the two episodes. You need them together in order to create one. And again, that duality of the two episodes, the two-hander, which is just really well done, and just very considered in how it moves not only the story along, but the characters, as again, as you mentioned, with how Joel is both pessimistic and pragmatic because he's lived in this world for so long, where Ellie still shows signs of enthusiasm or interest in the world around her and the environment. It doesn't necessarily see doom and gloom all the time. And
Mhm.
even with
And
the
trust
way,
people too, right? Like
yeah, or even with just the way that she wants to learn about
yeah.
the world, and those kind of things I think matter in a story like this, because again, it is a lot to take in every week. And watching this episode, you watched it 3 times, I've watched it twice. It is a lot to literally endure, I think. And when you're watching it, it's an amazing piece of filmmaking. um if anybody is interested in the cinematography and the visuals of this episode, or in the last couple episodes, I highly recommend following Eben Bolter's
Yeah.
Twitter account, because he is posting all these amazing, not only
Lighting
screenshots.
breakdowns and like
it,
different things and like
it's
yeah.
it's a tutorial in this show, and it's so well done.
It
So
makes me
highly
so
recommend
jealous. I'm
following
like,
him.
man, I want to work on the second season so bad. I know that would mean that we probably couldn't do a show like this, but
Yeah,
like, or maybe we could. I don't know.
we could
But
be the
like,
second
it
official Last of Us
I'm like,
podcast.
at least even or whoever's listening, if anyone from The Last of Us show is listening, if you could somehow get Eric and I to come on the set, that's all we want. Like, I just
Yeah.
want to see a little bit of this being made in Calgary because, like, it is, it's gorgeous but brutal and yeah, his breakdowns on Twitter have been fantastic. He's been great. All right, let's get into it, Eric. Let's do a scene by scene breakdown of what happens in episode 5. It ends how it ends. That's not what the episode's called, but we like to start these things with a quote. No cold open again. They've kind of gotten rid of that. They only did that with kind of the setup of the outbreak in those first couple episodes. So that's a continuing theme. No cold opens anymore. So after the wonderful credits, which you should never skip, we begin with kind of the rebels taking over the Kansas City quarantine zone. We see Fedra being kind of murdered and dragged into the streets in absolutely brutal ways. Um, you can see kind of people being shot and beaten and hung, and just chaos in the streets of Kansas City as it's being quote unquote liberated from Fedra. The rebels then patrol the streets looking for Fedra collaborators. We then see the man and the child from the last episode that we saw at the very end, the stinger. The man, which we know as Henry, I guess I don't have to, you know, read it in that way. We've all seen the episode, hopefully. So Henry's talking in sign language to the young boy that they have to lay low and get out of there. Um, we then, Eric, at any point, please cut me off if you want to talk about any scene, or
All
else I'm
right.
just going to
Well,
keep
Matt, I'm going
going.
to tell you to shut up right now because the one thing we do need to mention, this is written by Craig Mazin and directed by Jeremy Webb.
I did say that earlier,
Oh,
but
okay. Well, then
we
I
can
was
say it
not
again.
listening.
It was during my intro I said it, so no
Okay.
worries. So how fucking dare you? Um, so then we cut to Kathleen, who enters like a detention camp and interrogates a group of Fedra collaborators that ratted out on their neighbors for food and supplies. She's holding them all prisoner. Um, she mentions to them that no one has to die if as long as they'll get a trial and they'll do their time for their crimes against kind of these rebels. She says that she wants them to know where Henry is, so she's basically interrogating them, saying, if you know where Henry is, you need to tell me. um she threatens, she tells Tommy, but she tells Perry, I think is the character's name.
Yes. Yep.
Kathleen tells Perry to kill them. A man speaks up and says, whoa, 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 and says Henry is with Edelstein. Edelstein is the doctor that we met in the previous episode. So everything in this
Played
moment
by
is taking
John
place.
Getz.
Yeah, so John gets as Edelstein. We know that he is now dead, but these are flashbacks to what happened leading up to those moments. Kathleen's surprised that Edelstein is a collaborator. She says, "Oh, at least he was a lot more discreet than you fucking idiots," which I think is a great line.
And delivered by Melanie
Um,
Linsky in almost not a comedic way, but there is a sarcastic kind of sense of humor. And even this
yeah,
scene, I think I wrote down, it reminded me of the Red Scare and McCarthyism and communism and people ratting out on each other in order to survive or not be, blacklisted in a way. And it kind of feels a little bit like that in terms of, dealing with the political strife of the 1950s. And so it's almost
yeah.
weirdly cyclical that it's coming back again, but history repeats itself, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Especially put in these times, yeah. So that man says that Henry's held up somewhere. Um, Kathleen calls him a rat, which I think is funny because he ultimately does what she wants, and then she goes, "I shouldn't be surprised. You're a rat." Um, Kathleen then argues with Perry whether they should look for Henry right away. Um, Basically, she says he's her first priority, not her like fifth priority. I think that's this conversation here. So, he goes, "Are we really gonna?" Perry goes, "Are we really gonna put them on trial?" And she goes, "Of course not." She's like, "When you're done, just burn the bodies. It's faster." So she's absolutely ruthless, just basically going, "No, we're just gonna murder them all and burn their bodies." And you're like, Jesus Christ, woman. Like, holy hell, okay. um we then cut to Henry and Sam as they make their way into an apartment building. We realize this is the one from the prior episode that that Kathleen and Perry find, right? It's in the previous
Yes,
episode
yeah,
that they
yeah, and
find it. Yeah.
it's 11 days before, right? Like that's kind of
Yes.
like where the
Did they
episode.
did they give us?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
because
it's
I wrote
about,
that
yeah,
down. Eleven
it
days
is because
prior.
we get 10 days later
Yeah,
after this sequence. Yes. So
yeah.
we realize it's the same building that Kathleen and Perry found empty in the previous episode. Dr. Edelstein is the one who hides Sam and Henry in the attic of this building, or kind of like the upper level. Um, Henry has a little bit of fun, I wrote down. They do not have any ammo. Um, so The doctor then has a conversation with Henry about what's going on and how much food they have and different things like that. Sam has one of those I forget what they're called, but that those toys that you could write on and rip up, and then
It's not an
I had one as a
Etch-a-Sketch, but
kid
it's
too. Yeah,
kind of in that zone. Again, anybody who comments afterwards can let us know, but,
correct us. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and, like,
I
again,
forget
like,
the
this.
name. I had one too. You could write on it and you
Yeah,
pull up, and then
and then it
which I think
cleans
is a
off, and
great.
then it's, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
think it's a great use for this character.
totally, and, like, it's important that this scene, the way it plays out, because you have Edelstein, giving Henry some advice on how to talk to Sam about
Yeah,
being afraid, because
yeah.
Sam is interpreting how Henry feels, right? And if he's afraid, then Sam will
Then
be
Sam
afraid.
is exactly the thing that I wrote down. So then Henry goes over to Sam and tells him that they're going to be safe and that he's not scared and that he needs Sam to be strong. Um,
I also wrote down
Henry then
Super
joke,
Sam because he does all these
yeah,
comic book
yes, that's what
drawings.
I.
So
It's great. So, that's the moment where Henry then jokes that the place is very drab looking and it looks ugly, and he needs Sam to help make it look nicer. So he gives him a giant bag of crayons, and they start writing on the walls. And we know from the previous episode, I think there were all these drawings of like superheroes on the wall and stuff like that. So then we're about to see that. So then we get a flash that says 10 days later. And we know in that previous conversation that Dr. Edelstein and Henry had, that they had about 10 days worth of food or 11 days worth of food. Um, so we know that they are running out of food at this moment. So Henry and Sam are still hiding out in the attic, and you can see now that Sam has decorated the attic with lots of paintings and drawings. Sam, goes over to Henry and says, like, I'm hungry. Can we eat that last? I think they have like one can of
beef stew.
chili or whatever's left, beef stew. Thank you.
It was an
Left.
important
So
note I wrote.
yeah, beef stew. It's not Chef Boyardee this time. But uh, Henry kind of goes like, we have to kind of ration it. We can't eat it right now. I know you're hungry, but we kind of need to save it. Henry then looks at the windows to see kind of the rebels going through the street. They're going door to door to try to find. This is when Kathleen sends them out, and they're kicking down doors to try to find um, where Henry and Sam are. Sam asks if the doctor is coming back, and Henry goes, "Yeah, yeah, he's gonna come back." Um, and then basically, later Henry wakes up Sam after Sam has been taking a nap or sleeping, and says the doctor isn't coming back. He says that they don't have any food and that they need to leave, and he knows the rebels' patterns so they can sneak out. Then you get this heartbreaking moment when Sam asks if they killed the doctor, and then Henry doesn't want to lie to Sam, so he goes, "Yeah, they probably killed him." So they hug and they look around at Sam's paintings. At this moment, you can tell Henry realizes that Sam is very scared in this moment, and he probably remembers that conversation with Edelstein about being like, you can't show that you're scared because then it'll make this kid scared. So he tells Sam to lightly close his eyes. And then you get this nice moment where he paints kind of, which we do see at the end of last episode when he's holding the gun to Joel, right? He has
Yeah.
the red across his eyes. So we now see that moment where Henry paints kind of a superhero mask on uh, Henry paints that on Sam's face, um, which I think is wonderful. You can see like he shows that he's a superhero and he can get through these moments. Um,
I want to say as well, with being
yeah,
in that attic for as long as they were, a great way, and a very subtle and clever way of conveying, an amount of time passing by, is the drawings on the wall, and
and how many and
the lack of food, or the diminishing number of cans that they have left. And I think, like, that's just a very subtle and clever way to show, like, okay, it's been, this many days since they first arrived there. And like obviously you can see, on the walls all these drawings, and it also will play out again a little bit because of the daycare that they go to later on, and the
Yeah.
drawings on the wall there. So again, there's thematic symmetry throughout this entire episode that really is very thought out, but doesn't feel intrusive to the narrative and kind of showy.
They then head downstairs, and they're about to kind of leave the building, and then they hear a car crash and shooting. So at this moment, Henry says to Sam that they're shooting outside and that to get low, Henry looks outside, and then we see what Eric mentioned earlier, the other perspective of the previous episode where Henry is watching the shootout between Joel and the Kansas City Rebels. Sounds like a football team, across the street. So yeah, I love these kind of moments too, where you're seeing something from a previous episode or something that happened from a different vantage point from a different character.
Like the movie
That was
Vantage Point.
you're not wrong. Or Lost, also with Matthew Fox. You get a lot of that. So you see it from Henry's standpoint. You even see that Joel looks over at one moment and might have seen Henry across the street before he ducks down. Sam asks what's happening. Henry answers that they need a new plan. So time passes and they sneak around in a dark building. They step on glass, which at this moment you should start to go, oh, okay, I know what they're leading up to now, based on the last episode. And then now the timelines converge where we get the moment of Henry and Sam holding up Joel and Ellie at gunpoint as they wake them up in the middle of the night. So I love that in movies and TV. Like I like the kind of, obviously bringing back Lost again. I love a flashback. I love a different perspective and those kind of things. I love timelines converging,
Converging.
uh, converging. Thank you, Eric. The pills I'm on are making me loopy, everyone. I'm sorry. And they're prescribed by a doctor, not recreational. And I love the converging timelines and seeing it from two different perspectives and then leading up to the same moment. So I kind of love that we spent the first act of this episode getting to that moment, which was the stinger or the cliffhanger at the last episode. So it introduces you to those characters, kind of gets you to understand where they're at that moment, and then it's a clever cliffhanger in the last episode. Immediately, Henry says that they don't want to hurt them, but they want to help them. And he goes, we didn't do anything. We didn't hurt you. We'll put our guns down and you guys don't do anything to us. Um, Joel says everything is fine, but clearly doesn't believe that, which I think there's a good moment there between like um, Ellie and Joel and Henry, where like Joel is clearly pissed or upset about all this, and and Ellie's like, just fucking like, what are you doing, man? Why'd you say it like that? Which I think is really funny. And basically, he reluctantly kind of lets them kind of do their thing. You can see that Henry and Sam are still holding them up. They don't put their guns down, but they introduce themselves as the most wanted men in Kansas City. But it looks like Joel and Ellie are a close second. Um, at this point, they put their guns down and we cut to them sharing some food around a lantern. They're eating, is it beef jerky or chocolate or what are they having? It
I
looks
think
like
it's
either a chocolate ball or barred
a chocolate
jerky or
ball.
something.
Yeah, I think it is either jerky or chocolate. I mean, it might be jerky, but I think like again from the perspective of Sam, like he seems to really like it. But again, when you're starved, you'll obviously
Oh, yeah,
like it
when you're
goes
eating
back to the
canned
episode 3,
20-year-old
right?
canned food, yeah, then, yeah, anything would taste amazing, yeah,
Yeah.
so, yeah, Joel then you can see, even after all of this, like, Joel there is some, like, a sympathetic kind of, like, good person in there, even if he's done some bad shit or he doesn't trust anyone because he gives some of his extra food to, Sam
Yeah, I think
because
to
Sam
children
is
specifically, he's more
yeah,
sympathetic, or adolescents, because
yeah.
again, like we've seen this already, and we'll see it more as the series does move on. Is that he? there is the humanity of the character. He sees people, children specifically, and feels bad that they have to grow up in this time period and that they shouldn't have to
Yeah.
deal with the things that they're dealing with. And I think also with this scene, just going back quickly to
Yeah.
when Henry and Sam kind of have the guns on them, I think it's important in looking at Joel's character in that moment, because again, we're seeing the weariness and sort of the wear and tear of this character, starting to really come through, where he's not as alert or sharp as maybe he once was. And we saw that in the last episode, with the young guy who kind of, got the best of him, and Ellie had to come in and save him in the laundromat. So, we're seeing these moments play out in a way that feels important to the character, and it's helping
Yeah.
move the story along, but it's specifically building on who Joel is now. And maybe, he's a former version of himself, because when you get older, you change, and physically, your body begins to slow down. And you see that in just him waking up and asking if he can kind of sit up when he's lying down, like just those little
Mhm.
things.
Yeah, and this is multiple times where he's told Ellie, like, "Don't worry about it. Like, I got this," and then
Yeah,
he lets someone sneak up on them, right? So because of it, whether it's the hearing they mentioned, or like you said, just the wear and tear on his body, as he's a 56-year-old man in this show, right? I think he mentions.
yeah.
So yeah, I definitely understand that with some of the conversations we had before we started recording. As you get older, and I'm only 34. Um, Anyway, so then basically Ellie asks how old Sam is. He's 8 years old, and Ellie introduces herself. She punches Joel in the leg and makes him introduce himself to them as well. Uh, Joel immediately goes, "Okay, you didn't kill us. We didn't kill you. I think we're all good here. Can we just go?"
Just consider it a
Um,
win.
yeah, consider that a win, which I think is great. Um, Henry then says that he knows a way out and that he can help them. This is when they go upstairs and take a look at the overlay, like the basically at the lay of the land at the upper levels of the building, to kind of look out into Kansas City.
And it's during the day,
Um,
and it's in kind of a
yeah,
boardroom.
yes.
And Henry refers to it as Killer City, which I think is kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah, that is actually kind of interesting. They talk about how Casey Fedra were monsters and that they raped and murdered people and tortured people. And like even Joel says he heard that Kansas City Fedra was one of the worst and just were awful, awful people. Henry reveals that they overtook Fedra 10 days ago and overtook the quarantine zone, and which is something we see when Joel and Ellie first get into the city, right? They look over and they're like surprised that the quarantine zone is abandoned and stuff like that. Um, Henry then reveals at this point that he isn't Fedra. He's worse. He says he's a collaborator, and Joel immediately kind of gets pissed and says that he doesn't work with rats. So that there's some history there with in Joel's line of work, and in the 20 years we didn't know during this outbreak of how people viewed collaborators, especially in quarantine zones. They seemed like the worst of the worst. But Henry says that they need each other and that they will work together.
And I like
Because
the way
Henry,
that Lamar Johnson delivers that line. Like he's like, "Today you do." Like
yeah,
it's
he's like, I don't
aggressive.
work with rats, right? When he goes,
Yeah,
well, now, or yeah, today you do, yeah,
yeah. Like that is a really great little piece of acting, where like it's just like the line could have been delivered in so many ways, but it's just like that kind of like, well, you know what? I-
assertive, but like
Yeah,
confident, and like, but like a guy who is probably intimidated by Joel, but like also knows what he has and knows what he needs from Joel. And I agree with you. I think that's just a very assured acting and just a great moment. Um, Henry says that he needs Joel to help get out alive, and then he says the line, "I show you the way, you clear the way," which I think is great as well. We also now see Ellie and Sam, who are sitting kind of at the large boardroom table, and they're playing around and laughing together, which is a very sweet moment where Henry looks and he's like, "I haven't seen that in Sam in a very, very long time. So it's just kind of this nice moment where you just see, like you said at the beginning, Eric, like the and why Joel is sympathetic towards children is like they grew up in this world, but they're not as maybe pessimistic or view it in the same way as people like Joel and even Henry, who maybe Henry must have been very young at the during the outbreak, right? But
Yeah, but there's that
still
maturity again
maybe,
where he's had to grow
yeah,
up and become almost basically Sam's father, you know, in a lot of
yeah,
ways. And like again, like this scene really shows you that like, you know, once they've been able to establish a relationship, you know, Henry is honest about that he's not somebody that necessarily is, you know, a murderer. The guns aren't even loaded. It's all for show for a lot of ways, and they're just
right.
trying to survive and make it through, and they need somebody like Joel and Ellie to a certain degree because they've dealt with, you know,
Clickers
clickers
and
and the infected, and they're kind of more the muscle, right? You know, it's brains and bronze coming together to get to the other side. And what's kind of
yeah,
fascinating about this scene is it's them planning their escape, and it kind of almost in this one moment becomes a heist movie where they're talking about how they're going to, you know, get
sneak through the
through the rest
tunnels
of
and get
the
out. Yeah,
city.
yeah. So that's when Joel finally agrees and asks him how they're going to get out. So Henry mentions that Kathleen and that she's the leader of the resistance. Um, he says the way out is to use the tunnels. There's maintenance tunnels throughout the whole city because the same developer built some of the buildings in the downtown area. So there's no subway or anything like that, but they built all these maintenance tunnels that go from
Nowhere to
building
eat
to building.
fresh.
Um, um, and then he goes, "Did you ever notice something about the city?" And then they go, "There's no infected." And then Henry explains that Fedra pushed all the infected underground about 3 years ago, and that that's why he needs a killer like Joel.
Just in
Henry
case they
tells
run into
Sam,
some
yeah,
infected, because
because
Henry
Joel kind of
says,
goes,
well, I was just going to
"Go
say
ahead."
that Henry says that his contact with Fedra when he was working for them said that they cleared most of the infected out, and that's where he's getting his information from.
Yeah, because Joel is reluctant, going like, "How do you? There's probably a bunch of them down there. Like, why would we ever do that?" And then he goes, "Well, that's what everyone thinks, and even Kathleen thinks that they're all down there. But he heard that there's only maybe a few scattered left, and that they push them out or somewhere else." So then Henry turns to Sam and says that they're going to help them, even before Joel agrees. Which I think is again that assured kind of like, I know we need each other kind of thing, which I like. We then cut to all four going into a Bank of America to find the tunnels. They head down a staircase into the maintenance tunnels. Joel tells Ellie to get her gun out, and she looks pleased that he kind of trusts her to use her gun, especially in a situation like this. Um, Henry mentions that her dad is a pessimist, and they both go, "I'm not her dad," or "He's not my dad," kind of thing at the same time. Which at this point you can tell that they were starting to bond, but they're still very like Joel doesn't want to look at Ellie that way. It's still kind of that cargo thing that he won't admit that he's starting to be a father figure to her and stuff like that. And he wants to make sure people know that like she's not related to me. I'm not her dad. And she says the same thing, which I think is interesting. They make their way through the tunnels cautiously. So all of this is, I haven't really talked about the differences between the game and the show a lot, but like first off, they changed the location to Kansas City. I kind of already mentioned that. Henry and Sam, uh very similar to their characters in the game. Sam is not deaf in the video game, so that's a change that they made for the show. um they also, all this tunnel stuff is ripped straight from the game. It's slightly different than obviously what they're doing here because there's no Kathleen in the game, but like all of this is uh very accurate to what happens in the game. So that's why I'm constantly impressed to being like, well, they add all this stuff and they make it feel like it is from the game, but like a lot of it is brand new to it. So they head down into the maintenance tunnels. They go through cautiously. They come to an entrance that's all decorated with children's drawings, much like Sam's drawings in the attic, like Eric mentioned. The juxtaposition there is really interesting. So um, Henry, no, sorry, Sam is going to go through the door, and then Joel kind of stops him and goes, "No, what are you doing? Like, I'll go through first." So Joel enters the room and discovers some like a daycare that people might have been hiding and living in underground. So like an underground settlements. Joel mentions that he heard about this, that people went underground after the outbreak to kind of hide from the infected and to kind of get away from the surface and get away from people. If people who played the game, I already mentioned Ish. This is where you get an Ish reference. They show a drawing on the one of the boards there, and it says like protector, daddy, or father, or something like that, and it has Ish's name. So Ish, I don't know if they'll ever adapt this story because I do think that if they ever do like a spin-off show, they might do individual stories from, basically tales from, the outbreak or whatever they want to call it. Last of Us Factions is one name people throw around because that's what they called the multiplayer
Ishtar.
aspect of Last of Us. So basically, Ish is a character from the Last of Us video game that you never meet, but when you go through these tunnels and see these underground settlements, you learn his story through basically environmental storytelling. So you pick up notes, you read letters from Ish, you read basically things, you find people infected and not infected, and you find out what kind of happened to Ish and these people that were living underground. And it even starts above ground where they like it's this like long form storytelling, not super long, but you could completely miss it if you don't pick up all these notes and read them in the video game. But that's the kind of stuff in the game as you explore and you find things and find these notes. They're not necessary, but that's kind of the world building and the storytelling you get from some of that environmental stuff. So it's like a fun nod to that. And I do think if they ever do a spin-off of this show, which I think they probably will because of how successful it is and how singular this story will be, and they'll want to kind of expand on this world. Um, I do think we'll eventually get an anthology series that basically takes it's going to be like the Bill and Frank episode is a perfect kind of backdoor pilot for that show. Is just like we can tell these one-off stories in this world that are either from the game, if from notes we found, or things like that, or completely original stories, and they each can just be one episode little mini movies that I think could be really great. So anyways, that was a side tangent, but I
I
like
want to
that
also
little
add
ish
something
reference.
as well because you mentioned it on the last episode, and I think it's important to maybe discuss is that when you're adapting from one medium to another, there are things you're going to leave out, or there are things that you're going to change, and maybe one version of something that maybe is similar or has some sort of comparison might be removed, or again you might be like, okay, maybe one is enough. You mentioned that in the game there's a sequence where they go through a school, right?
Yeah.
It almost
That's in the Bill
feels
and Frank episode, or Bill and Frank's Bill section of the game.
I wonder if maybe Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann took that out because of the daycare kind of being somewhat similar, of kind of a place where children go, a place of safety and innocence, and kind of being deserted. And it's like, okay, well, if we one, it would probably take away from the Bill and Frank episode and kind of slow things down, but also with this episode it kind of feels almost like that's making up for it.
Yeah, I can see that. The school in the video game isn't played out necessarily in the same way. It's more of like an action set piece, I think, from my
I'm
memory
just
of
saying more
like
of
you
the
have to.
environment. I'm not saying necessarily
Yeah,
about like,
totally. Like
yeah.
I totally understand them cutting out the school section, even though there's like a couple iconic moments and stuff like that in that section of the game. But like, um, I this is directly like if you look at when you go in to the video game in these moments, like the set design is ripped. It reminds me of the hotel moment in this series and a couple other things where it looks exactly like it does in the game. Like you're just like, oh shit, they did this not one to one, but it just feels ripped from the game. And I completely agree that you have to cut down somewhere, right? And like a lot of the times they're cutting out more of the locations and sequences that have a lot of action, just because in a video game you kind of need that. Where here the character moments and the environment moments are a little bit more important. So the school, in the grand scheme of things, probably to your point of being similar with how the characters might react at those places. And like, uh, no future spoilers, but we get more school stuff eventually too, right? So like, I think that's probably why you cut the other school moment out. It's just it was a high school that they go to earlier, but I think this moment is great because you it is that environmental storytelling, right? Like it's not like in the game where someone picks up a letter and reads Ish's story, but you kind of get it through the toys that are there, the drawings that are there, the just the way that the environment is. And then you have like, Ellie ask about what happened, I think. And then, Joel goes, well, someone might have not followed. There was a whole bunch of rules on the wall. I didn't screenshot it to see what they all said, but basically you had to follow these rules so an infected wouldn't get in. And Joel just theorizes that, someone didn't follow the rules and they probably all got infected and died. Right. So,
Mhm.
it's, yeah, I do love this moment and it feels ripped straight from the game. This is when we also get, I think the first time we see Savage Starlight in the show, I believe, unless we saw Ellie with one earlier, I don't remember, but like Savage Starlight ripped straight from the game. Um, this is interesting because they did change the fake video game that they play to be Mortal Kombat. So it is interesting that they kept the original comic book that they created for The Last of Us instead of making it some actual comic series, especially because Warner Brothers has all the DC stuff. They could have easily uh, maybe done a DC comic or something like that. But they go with Savage Starlight, which I like. And then Ellie and Sam share a moment about which issues they found. So I like that as a little thing because in the game, Savage Starlight is a collectible that you get and you find them and give them to Ellie as you're exploring. And she talks about like, oh, I have issue blah 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 as she's going through. So like I like that they've included that here. That's where the endure and survive the title of this episode comes from. And then I love the bonding moments between Ellie and Sam here, because even talking with my wife Nevis, like leading into this episode, she's like, I'm not sure if I care about Ellie yet. She's like, it's not that I dislike her, but it's what we talked about at the beginning of it takes some time to kind of, she's a teenager, she's snarky sometimes, she is curious, but like um to really care about Ellie, I feel like in this episode especially you see her relationship with Sam, because all we've had her is with other adults, right? For the most part, like her interacting with Joel or Tess or other people that they've come across, where her seeing her with another kid that's not necessarily her age, but just how she acts with Sam, another kid, I think really kind of brings, like, I don't know, makes you really start to care about Ellie, I think, in this episode even more so. Like I already did at that point, but that might be from the game and different things. But I think like
Well,
especially a moment we get to later. Yeah.
she's acting more naturalistic with Sam, or
Right.
like her age. And I think when she's acting alongside, Joel or Tess or any of the other adults that she comes into contact with, she's kind of giving her version of being a grown up, right? And that's that
Yeah.
kind of very put upon performative thing that kids do, where it can be very precocious and a
Yeah.
little bit kind of mannered in that style. But yeah, you begin to really appreciate the performance that Bella Ramsey is giving here, because there is more to it than just simply a caricature. Even though, again, the frustration of those first few episodes of her kind of being the sort of comedic sidekick and having that kind of um loudmouth kind of sarcasm, or the quippiness of it, does feel like it breaks some of the tone and the themes and takes you out of it a little bit. But then you begin to understand more of why she acts like that. And again, like you'll learn more as you move on, but this is the first time where you see some of that shield kind of coming down, and you just see
Yeah.
her as a kid again, and that is
Yeah.
also really nice as well. And obviously
Yeah.
you mentioned that with Sam earlier, where he laughs and he has a moment of feeling like things are normal again.
Yeah. I love it. So Joel wants to keep going, but then everyone kind of wants to wait it out a bit in the settlement. Because I love Ellie's line of there's shit to actually do here because there's like toys and different things like that. So like Joel reluctantly agrees as he usually does throughout this whole show. And then Sam and Ellie are then playing soccer, which I love. There's like a little goal painted on the wall and which is straight from the game as well. Joel and Henry have a conversation where Joel apologizes for his rat comment because he's starting to look at Sam and Ellie uh, playing together, and then he understands. He's like, if you did it for him, like I understand, kind of thing of why you might have done that. Um, Henry then opens up to Joel and says that he lied about never killing anyone. I forgot if we mentioned that moment earlier, but Eric, you brought it up a little bit where that's why he needed Joel. He's like, I've never hurt anyone. The most violent thing I've ever done was pointed a gun at you earlier, like kind of thing, right? So,
That wasn't even loaded.
Henry, yeah, so he goes, Henry, he talks to Joel saying that he lied about not killing anyone. He says he used to know a man, a great man you would follow anywhere. And he says Sam got sick with leukemia and he couldn't get his medicine. So he had to trade that one great man, and that one great man was the leader of the Kansas City Resistance, Kathleen's brother, to get the
Michael.
medicine for Sam. Michael, yeah.
Or Jesus Christ,
He
because
then
it kind
goes,
of feels like he
yeah,
is a Christ-like
the
figure,
savior,
right? Like
yeah,
the
yeah,
person who is going to, potentially bring, the suffering and the needy, up into the realm of where Fedra kind of the uprising begins, but not in a dark way, like, I mean,
yeah,
some
like
people could
Kathleen's way, yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, again, like, it's almost there's an interesting
I have to
thing
go to
there.
the bathroom. Keep talking.
Yeah, absolutely. Where you've seen this before in movies and television, and like even just thinking about like in historical aspects where you have political figures and how, you know, someone wants to do something one way and then you have another person wanting to do it another way, and the goal is still the same, but the way in which they do it is completely different. I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to compare it in this way, but like something like, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and then, that kind of being an inspiration for, comic books with X-Men, with Professor X and Magneto, and that you have, two sides of a coin wanting to do something for, the people that, that they are trying to help, with civil unrest and civil, injustice. And so when you see or when you hear about Michael kind of being more of a pacifist, and then
Yeah,
Kathleen's approach being more um aggressive and violent and cruel, it kind of reminds you of, again, like that X-Men thing where it's like, you have
Magneto versus
Charles,
Professor X, yeah.
yeah, and they were kind of they were based on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. That was kind of an inspiration for those characters. So again, people might have the same goal in mind, but the way to get it is always different, and it just depends on the person.
So you see that Sam was obviously, or Henry was very close with Michael, and was part of this resistance, and maybe even we don't know if it's second in command or new enough, but like he was obviously very close to Michael, and gave him up because with Sam having leukemia. And there wasn't barely any medicine. The only way he could get it is to trade Fedra for it, and the only thing that they wanted was that basically that one good man. So then there's a great conversation where Henry says he's a bad guy because he did a bad guy thing, even though it was to try and save the one that he loves. And I think that's important. So like if you bookmark that, because I feel like people who have played the game will see a lot of this stuff and maybe think it's a little bit overboard. of how hard they're hammering home some things of like just the kind of when I don't want to say too much, but like it's just these things are important. I think are great character development. Like it's like what I mentioned in the letter that from Bill to Joel. You can kind of see even from Pedro Pascal's performance the way he's looking at Henry and listening to what he said and just kind of like understanding what he went through and kind of learning from that. And it goes back, like, if you look at it's like you fight for the ones that you love, right? Like even if you think you're doing a bad thing, it might feel selfish, but what else do you have in this very bleak world other than that person, that one person, so you're not alone, right? And that comes back at the end of this episode as well.
And the
um
betrayal as well, I think also, again, going back to Michael kind of being almost described as like a Christ-like figure,
yeah,
Henry, the way that he talks about his betrayal almost sounds like Judas in a
Judas,
way.
yes.
And so,
Yeah.
not to get too Christian or anything, but it does
What is
feel a
this,
little bit.
Lost?
Yeah, it does. Well, I
Another
mean, yeah.
Lost reference.
What was the character's name? The Jack Shepherd, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
with Matthew
Little on the
Fox.
nose, that whole show.
Yeah.
It ends in a church and were they all dead? Well,
A shepherd
sort of.
leading his flock, right? Like, that's,
Yeah.
but it does, like, that moment does as well have like a biblical connotation of like, of,
Totally.
the Christ figure being sacrificed or betrayed
One
by
versus
the
all,
the
yeah.
person who's closest to him, and then that Christ-like figure also forgiving the
Yeah,
person who betrayed him.
which we'll get to in a little bit. But yeah, like I mentioned, great internalized performance from Pedro Pascal. I think in each of these moments, there's a lot of them where Joel, being a quieter guy, um, you get a lot just from Pedro Pascal's face in a lot of these things that you can learn a lot from the character just by watching his kind of internalized performance. Uh, Henry then says to Joel, "You might not be her father, but you were someone's." And he realized that Joel was a father at one point because he can tell how he acts with Ellie and things like that. And at this moment, you can tell anytime Sarah is mentioned or Joel being a father is mentioned, he kind of shuts down. So that's when he immediately kind of goes, they've waited long enough and that they need to leave. So I think that's like a consistent thing throughout too, is like anytime someone brings up Sarah or that Joel was a father, he kind of shuts back down because I think he just has such regret for that moment. Um, so then we cut to Kathleen, and she's in an old bedroom. I said Game Tommy comes in, who is Perry, and they haven't found Henry yet. Kathleen asks how Perry found her. Perry says we talked to your mom, which I think is interesting, like that her mom's just out there and said she's probably here, which is we find out that it's Kathleen's old bedroom which she shared with her brother Michael when they grew up. She asks Perry if he's ever gone back to his childhood home, and he goes, "Fuck no, it's hundreds of miles away and not worth it," kind of thing. Um, she tells a story about her brother Michael and when they were a child, when they were children, how he helped her through a thunderstorm and kind of comforted her because she was always scared of the thunder, and said like if they were in this bedroom in their house, it was just this wooden box and nothing could get them if they were in this box. Um, Kathleen mentions that he was such a beautiful person and mentions how she is not. So um like you said, they build up Michael as being, caring and cares about his sister and cares about other people and will do anything to comfort people. And
He's like you, Matt. He's a
Kathleen,
Matt of the people.
yeah, a man of the people, a Mike of the people. Um, so she says like she even knows that her brother would forgive Henry, and she reveals that it's because he told her that he forgives Henry. Right before he was killed by Fedra in Fedra containment, Kathleen had a conversation with him, and Michael says like, "I understand, and that I forgive Henry for what he did." But Kathleen does not give a shit about what her brother says, and all she wants is revenge. She says she doesn't care, and that she's so much more ruthless than her brother. Perry then goes, your brother was a great man. We all loved him, dearly and cared about him, but he didn't change anything. You did. So I think that goes back to that like kind of pacifist versus, um, just the ruthlessness of Kathleen, that like her brother was a great man, got everyone to follow them, but he never actually changed anything. He always just talked about it, right? And then that her ruthlessness is the thing that kind of liberated Kansas City, even though it took her and the rest of the rebels being probably just as awful as Fedra was treating them, right? Like they killed them in the streets, they did all these horrible things, but she actually got shit done, which I think is interesting.
And it's
Um,
important, I think, as well with this scene and the last scene in terms of where they're set, because you have a childhood bedroom
yeah,
and you have a daycare. These are places of innocence. These are places where they're supposed to be safe. And in these moments, you have these two guest stars, these two characters who we've learned about in the last episode, confiding in somebody else and telling their part of the story and giving you more insight into who they are, their character motivations, but also whether or not they feel remorse or guilt for what they've done. And after watching those two scenes back to back, you realize that, what Henry did maybe wasn't the best way of going about it, but you understand that he was trying to get medication that Fedra had for Sam, who was suffering with leukemia, and Michael was somebody who sacrificed himself and was willing to forgive, and you understand that Henry is acknowledging the mistakes he made. With Kathleen, she knows who she is as a person, and her vengeance ultimately is the thing that does her in, because in order to lead, you need to put your own personal agenda or vendetta aside. And we see in that last episode, in episode 4, that the uprising, that bubbling, one uprising leads to another, the uprising of the people against Fedra, but now we're seeing the uprising of the fungus,
yeah.
and them not dealing with that. And that's something that should have been their first priority as soon as
When
they
Perry
saw it.
says, right, like
Yeah,
she goes, "This isn't my fifth priority. This is my first priority," and that's ultimately their downfall. Even though she led this uprising, her focus on vengeance is what gets them all killed, right,
yeah.
and ruins basically their whole rebel group, which
You
we'll get
done
to.
fucked up,
Yeah,
Kathleen.
in a moment. So, we're back now with the group in the tunnels. They've made it to the other side. Sam asks why they can't use lights. Henry says that they don't want to draw attention, but Henry also feels confident and happy that his plan worked, and tells them where to go. Ellie mentions that they're going to Wyoming, and Joel looks incredibly annoyed that she mentions that to him, which I think is just another funny moment. Ellie then, in an even funnier moment, makes fun of Joel's gruffness. Kind of says like, "Oh, he always does this." He goes, "Ellie, don't say anything." And then he ultimately comes around. A sniper then shoots at them out of nowhere, and they have to hide behind a set of cars. This is ripped straight from the game. This goes back to my comment in the earlier episodes with the shootout and different things, or even the clicker sequence in the museum in the second episode, of like how well the show basically showcases action moments from the game, which we get quite frequently in the game, but in the show they're more spread out. But they do it in such a way where I remember this moment from the game where you're a sniper is shooting at you, you're with Ellie, and you have to kind of get to this sniper to take them out as they're shooting at you, and you have to sneak around the cars and get to him. And it plays out differently obviously in a game, but it feels so accurately depicted in the way that it's shot, of just the muzzle flash from the house way down, and kind of things like that. So um this is obviously now different than what happens in the game, because like a lot of the stuff with Henry and Sam takes place in the tunnels, in that tunnel sequence, and I'm not even 100% sure if this sniper moment happens with Henry and Sam. I don't think it does, but because this whole action sequence that comes up after this is obviously, not obviously, is very new because of the Kathleen stuff and all that. That's all very, very new. But I'm trying to remember because how Henry gets bit, it must be similar. It must be the same. I'm replaying Last of Us Part 2 right now, and I just replayed Last of Us Part 1 for like the third time, but it all kind of like blends together sometimes. But anyways, this sequence feels ripped straight from the game. So you have Joel telling them that they need to hide behind this car, says he's a shit shot and he's not going to get them if they just hide and don't like leave the back of this car. Um, and then, Ellie doesn't want Joel to leave her, obviously. And then there's a great moment between them where Joel goes, "Do you trust me?" And she shakes her head, yes. So then Joel gets up, sneaks around the side of the house, goes down the street, goes upstairs as we hear gunshots from a room. An old man is sitting in a room with the sniper rifle. So Joel sneaks into the room, talks to the man, begs him. He's like, "Don't do it." He's like, begs the man not to do it. But then the man turns the gun on Joel, and we hear again off screen again, which is something we talk about frequently, both from probably a budget perspective and special effects thing of like, you don't need to show every instance of violence. It's just going to cost you more money or have to have digital blood or have a special effect, and sometimes it's even more intense if or when they show it off screen. So again, they show that Joel shot this man off screen, or they don't show it, sorry.
It's always the
um
aftermath that you see, and it weirdly
yeah,
reminds you of something like Lynn Ramsey's "You Were Never Really Here," where you never
yeah,
see the violence occur. Like, even when character like, with both, jumping ahead a little bit, but with both Tess and Sam being bit, you don't see
yeah.
them get bit, and I think that's another form of that kind of like, "Oh, we don't need to always show you, we can just show the aftermath of what
Makes for a better
happens."
reveal in those moments too, right? Like if you just see it happen, I don't think that's as interesting as
Yeah. I
how it
also
plays
wrote,
out.
though, and I think this is important, sniper in Adam's Family looking house,
Yeah. Oh
because
yeah,
it
it
does
looks like
look
a
like the
horror
Adams
house.
Family
Yeah.
house, yeah.
A little bit. Yeah, yeah, yeah. After Joel kills this man, he hears a woman's voice on the walkie-talkie that says that she's almost there. We can
"Anthony!"
get yeah, Tony. Says she's almost there. We realize that that's Kathleen's voice. Kathleen and her rebels then come in and plow the fuck out of a bunch of cars, which is pretty dope. And you hear Joel yelling, "Run!" to Sam, Henry, and Ellie. So Kathleen says, like, that's why you guys are in front. So this one car that we've seen in previous sequences, it's a big like snowplow looking truck thing that has, I forget what it says on the front of it, but it absolutely smashes through a bunch of cars to kind of plow those cars out of the way, and basically speeds towards Joel. No, sorry, speeds towards Ellie, Henry, and Sam. um, so at this moment, Joel is shooting at the driver of the snowplow. His gun
Mr.
is
Plow.
jamming as yeah, he's shooting at Mr. Plow. His gun is jamming, the sniper rifle's jamming, but he is able to get a shot off and smokes Mr. Plow right between the eyes.
"That's my
Um,
name, that name again, Mr. Plow."
So Mr. Plow plows now into a building, one of the houses on the street. It explodes, blowing up the house and the car. Kathleen and all of her men, including previous Tommy, come out of the other cars and look for Henry. She has Henry and Sam and Ellie pinned behind a car. Um, at this point, Joel is just kind of watching from the other building, not knowing what to do. Um, Henry then reveals himself to Kathleen and says, like, I forget exactly what he says, but he says he'll come out if she doesn't hurt the kids, I think is what he says. Um, he says, if you let the kids go, like I'll come out. And Kathleen says, no, sorry, I'm not going to do that. The girl is with the guy who killed Barry or whatever his name was. And that wasn't his name. I forget the other guy's name, but the kid that Joel kills. Um, and then she's like, and Sam's with you. So I'm not going to let them go. This moment I think is really
Brian.
great
Brian's the
where
name of the character.
Brian, thank you, Brian. Poor Brian. We
Poor
forgot
Brian.
Brian's name.
R.I.P.
Uh, pour one out for Brian. Although he's probably a horrible, shitty person if he's with Kathleen.
Yeah.
Basically, Kathleen's absolutely ruthless in this moment. Says kids die all the time. Maybe Sam was supposed to die. Did he ever think about that? And then there's this great kind of back and forth where she goes like, do you really think like is he worth everything? Like, is this one kid worth, basically this entire resistance and this good man? Basically that thing that Henry was struggling with. Like, is he worth everything? And I put eye emojis there. Again, lock that one up. It's important, I think. And because to Henry, I think his brother is worth everything. And I think that's like, again, ultimately what this show is about is like, yes, you might be able to help the bigger, grander scheme of things, but ultimately in this world, like, what do you have to live for? Um, and those aren't, just because he didn't give up Michael doesn't mean Michael would have liberated Kansas City and things like that too. So there's all that doubt of like a maybe because of something versus what you have and what you need to live to survive or have a life or who you care about or people who have potential like children especially, even though they're in this shitty world. There's
Well, it's the next
multiple
generation, right? Like, it's
but
it's
there's
it's
ways you can
the ones
think.
that are gonna survive and endure.
Yes, but then the bigger picture of things, I think that's that nuanced, interesting conversation you have, right? Like, uh, yes, you might be uh, looking out for the future of these children, but what future do they have? And weighing that someone you love and care about versus the greater good in people's opinion, right? Like it's not an objective thing per se because there is doubt on if Michael will do something and yada yada yada. But like that's going to be it's a super interesting conversation, which I think is like a theme throughout this whole series. Um Henry comes out with his arms up and tells Ellie to grab Sam's arm and run. Kathleen is about to shoot Sam. This is one thing in this episode that I'm not very negative towards the series as a whole, but this is a trope I hate in television and movies when the bad guy is about to kill someone and they don't because they hear a sound or something that happens. Like in reality, she would have just shot him immediately.
Yeah.
Like there's no reason for her to continuously wait. While I will argue in the later moment where we'll get to where she gets attacked by the little creepy clicker child, like maybe there's something in Kathleen's in the back of her mind where Michael is a good person and she's thinking about her brother and how he forgave Henry, that like maybe that's where her hesitation is in these moments. So there is that suspension of disbelief for me because they did set up Michael being such a forgiving great person. So maybe part of that is still in Kathleen when she has to pull the trigger, but like there
I
are these
disagree with
moments when
that.
yeah, I know I agree.
I honestly think that the thing is, like, I think you're right with the cliche of it, but if
Yeah.
you're gonna give them the benefit of the doubt, I think it's more that Kathleen is savoring the moment because she
Yeah,
is so sadistic, and at this
sure.
point, this is the only thing she really has to live for. It's not even leading the resistance anymore. It's about living in this moment of revenge, and, the idea that after she
Also
does
very
this.
important to this series, revenge and stuff too. So I think this
Yeah.
episode will be very important in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, but after she does this, it's like that's all she'll have. She'll just kind of be an empty shell, and then the thing that she if she were to live, that would probably fill her is finding new people to have confrontations with or turn
Yeah.
into, other Henrys. And so I feel like her savoring that moment of him, because realistically, like, as soon as he starts walking out, like, behind the car and coming into focus, she would have shot him. But
Yeah,
in
that's my and that happens in villains in movies and TV all the time, right? And that's like in Marvel movies, in James Bond movies, in anything with the hero's journey kind of thing, or any moment between a hero and a villain. It's like in real life, if they're that bad, they're just gonna immediately kill the good guy, right? There's no
Yeah.
reason to monologue. There's no reason to savor the moment. Like they're just going to kill the person, right? Like the
Or
minute
just leave them on
Henry,
a table with a laser about to cut them. It's like, "I'm not
yeah,
going to
like
kill you. I'm going to let
I'll
this
walk
do
out
it."
of the room, yeah, and then go
Austin
away. And like,
Powers actually addresses that. Seth Green's character is
yes,
like, "Aren't you just gonna shoot him in the head? We'll grab some guns and we'll shoot Austin Powers in the head together. Have a father-son moment." And that,
no,
like,
no, Scott.
no, you don't
That's-
understand. You have
yeah,
to set it up and,
and
toy with
so
them and
in a show that doesn't have those tropes per se, when they build up a villain like Kathleen, and in a world like this, like when you have those moments, it does take you out a little bit. So I would
yeah.
say that that's uh my biggest criticism of this episode as a whole, because this whole moment leading up into what is a great action set piece and an intense one, and probably the scariest or most intense sequence of the show. um it just, to get to that point, you had to do the kind of cliche villains about to kill the good guy, but then waits and slowly turns around as an explosion's happening, or the sinkhole that you set up in the previous episode. Sure. Um,
Sinkhole
you
de
know,
Mayo.
yeah, it happens. It's just like, I don't buy that. She would have immediately shot him in the goddamn head and then turned around to see what was happening behind her, right? So, anyways, the truck, Mr. Plow, falls into the sinkhole. Um,
Did you mention the
out from
quote
the
about Kathleen, though, quickly about, "It ends how it ends"?
No, sorry. That's
That's a
how
really
we
good
started
quote
this. Yeah.
because I feel like that line kinda sums up this episode as well a little bit, where, like, it ends how it ends, and you have to kind of accept that whether you like it or not. But yeah, and then I wrote click, click, boom. So
That's pretty good. So click, click, boom happens, and then out of the ground comes basically a sea of runners, clickers, and for the first time, a bloater. We don't get the bloater run away right away, but is this absolutely chaotic, intense scene as a bunch of runners and clickers pop out of the ground, like a horde of them. So everyone's scrambling. Joel keeps his eye on Ellie, trying to protect her with the sniper rifle as she's running around. So he keeps shooting clickers and runners that are coming after Ellie, because as we know from previous things, yes, she cannot be infected, but the infected don't just bite and leave you alone. Like sometimes they tear you apart, which we will see very literally in a moment with the bloater. Um, so at this moment, as everyone's scrambling, people are getting torn apart by clickers and runners. You see Henry and Sam running around, Ellie running around. We then get that shot, which was from the trailer, which is basically the bloater coming out of the ground, the first bloater we get in this series. This Game Tommy, or Perry, uh, uh, is looking at the bloater with Kathleen, tells her to run. The bloater then gets a hold of Perry and rips his head off, which is probably the most violent sequence, even though it's like kind of out of focus in the background in the entire show. But just an absolutely brutal sequence with this bloater.
a little
We then get
cliched,
an
I would say, as well. Like, that's another
Sure,
thing where you have the monster character that you haven't seen before and you have to show what it's capable of, and usually it takes out its anger or aggression, or it eats the person or does something to the most kind of either despicable character or a character that's kind of been set up as like a number 2. And it's almost like that's kind of like, okay, like
number two.
like when that's all breaking out, you would think at that point Perry would be like, "You're on your own. I'm out of
Yeah,
here.
fuck
I'm not
this.
dealing with this giant, friggin' bloater."
Yeah, I agree with you there as well. And then I like the child clicker that pops out here. She chases after Ellie, scrambles and crawls into the window of a car to try to hide. This is when we get this child clicker that runs after Ellie and crawls into the car and does a very malignant s kind of like like kind of gymnastics routine. Um basically climbs after Ellie. Ellie climbs out of the car. She sees that Sam and Henry is being attacked by clickers, runs over to them as Joel helps with the sniper rifle. Love this moment for fans of the game as well, because I think the way Ellie kills the clickers with her switchblade, very reminiscent of how Ellie would help you in the game when she tries to attack clickers or other things like that, with her switchblade. So immediately reminded me of that. Um, as they're starting to get away, and Joel is shooting at them for backup, Kathleen holds them all at gunpoint. Um, and then you get she very, is basically hesitant again, which I was like, I still don't buy this. Why is she waiting? Like, she would have shot them all like immediately, especially with all the chaos going on behind them, because she wants that satisfaction before a clicker could get them or a runner could get them. So she, she's holding them at gunpoint, doesn't shoot them, and then you have the kind of, again, very much like the bloater ripping off Perry's head. You have the payoff of the child clicker pouncing on her like a frog or something and
Clever
attacking her.
girl.
Yeah, like a raptor. That's perfect, Eric. Clever girl, yeah. So then you get her, and then that's the end of Kathleen. So um interesting way to get rid of that character.
Back to
Again,
Yellow
I
Jackets for
loved,
me.
yeah, again, but a great guest appearance by
Mhm.
Melanie Linsky, just absolutely crushed it. Um, the foursome then get away, and they are now hiding out at a motel. Uh, Basically with Joel. Joel meets up with them. Joel, Ellie, Sam, Henry all go to a motel, and now this is very similar again to what plays out in the game. Very one to one for the most part. For except for a one moment which I think is original to the show. So Ellie's reading the comic with Sam. Henry and Joel make fun of the endure and survive line from the comic and say it's a bit redundant, which I think is very funny. Joel then invites Henry and Sam to Wyoming with them, and Henry accepts. Henry goes into the room, tells Sam that he needs to get some sleep. I like this moment because Sam goes into the other bed, lies down. He gives like Ellie like a nod, like look after him kind of thing. But then I like, very, they've played up Ellie to be, doesn't follow by anyone's rules and kind of does her own thing. That immediately when Henry closes the door, she wakes up or goes over to Sam and says like, get back up. We'll continue reading the comic. Um, Sam looks kind of upset as they're reading the comic together. He writes on his notepad toy that he asks Ellie if she ever gets scared. They have a great combo through writing. Sam says that Ellie never looks like she's scared. She says she's scared all the time. She says that she's scared of ending up alone. She asks Sam what he's afraid of. He then asks, if you turn it into a monster, is it still you inside? And then he pulls up his pant leg to show that he was bitten on the ankle, which we know from earlier in the show with environmental storytelling. He has about 12 hours or so before he turns. Uh, so absolutely heartbreaking in this moment. We already kind of mentioned it earlier with the similar to the Tess reveal, where in these big chaotic moments, we don't necessarily see a character get bit. And fans of the game knew this is coming, knew this episode was coming, knows this moment is coming, but um, just for a show that absolutely tears your heart out every week, like it's just another horrible, heartbreaking moment because you're starting to care about Henry and Sam, especially Sam, his story. This kid just can't catch a break kind of thing. Like Henry's doing everything to protect him. Um, and just in this big thing of what Kathleen's revenge, it ends up just, ultimately we'll get to it, costing both of their lives. So Kathleen kind of does get what she wants, but it's just kind of, it's, no one wins in this situation. Kathleen's dead, Perry's dead, and then this horrible shit happens. So especially a kid who, um, doesn't have his hearing, who got leukemia, and now this happens. It's just this brutal world that God, this show sometimes. in the game. I dealt with this 10 years ago, Eric, and now I had to relive it. So it's horrible. So anyways, Ellie cut me off at any moment, but Ellie and Sam continue the conversation. Ellie immediately then shows Sam the bite that she has on her arm, basically to show that, like, hey, like I've also been bitten and I didn't turn. I'm immune. My blood is medicine, she says to him. So she cuts her hand open and then kind of puts her blood onto Sam's wound, essentially saying, hoping that if she is immune, that her blood could go into his bloodstream and help him being immune. I really love this moment. It's not. I don't. It's not from the game. And I just like this character moment from Ellie, and shows that she's still very much a child and she doesn't understand her immunity, and that she really does just want to help this kid, and that her thinking that just her blood alone could just help him, and I think she genuinely believes it in that moment, and it's very different than that moment with the child in the very first episode where we see that child get euthanized after he's has a bite mark on him from Fedra, of them telling him basically just to kind of, you know, basically make him feel better before they kill him, where I feel like Ellie truly believes that she could help him with her blood, which is why she doesn't tell anyone, why she stays awake with him, why she ultimately falls asleep, because she kind of thinks that her blood actually might help. So Sam does ask Ellie to stay awake with him, and she says she promises. Ellie gives him a hug. Um, but she ultimately does doze off in a chair. She wakes up and sees Sam staring at the window. She goes over to him, and he is infected and attacks her. Um, Basically, Sam chases Ellie out of the room and is on top of her. And we've already kind of mentioned it at the beginning of the show, but um, you know, Joel runs over to get a gun. Henry stops Joel and shoots at Joel to make him stand back. But then he immediately shoots his own brother in the head, killing him. In this moment, Henry's then processing and is horrified with what he's done. He points the gun at Joel, basically saying it's his fault, um, and then points the gun at his head and shoots himself and kills himself. Um, which is where the game kind of cuts. And I'm surprised we got an extra scene here, because the game kind of cuts there just with Ellie's kind of scream and them going, no, 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 no. And then uh, we do get another scene here afterwards of them burying their bodies. Like, it does cut to them, which I think is ultimately to get to this moment with Ellie, where Joel is burying their bodies. Ellie has the etch a sketch kind of thing. She writes, "I'm sorry" on it and puts it on Sam's grave. Joel looks pretty distraught. Ellie just says, "Which way do we need to go?" or "Which way is west?" And then Joel points in a direction and Ellie just kind of walks off defeated. And then Joel follows. And I forget the song that plays in the credits, but
Fuel
I
to
have it here
Fire
somewhere.
by
Yeah,
Agnes Obel.
thank you. And that is episode 5 of The Last of Us. A downer of an ending, especially with these, like I said, these characters that we've I think really loved at the end of, or this whole episode. I guess it's again a Bill and Frank thing where we learn about their stories and their ultimately their downfall in the same episode. But yeah, just an intense and sad ending quite again.
Yeah, it kind of has like a of mice and men kind of quality to it, where there's this weird hope where, after they've left Kansas City, or they're about to leave Kansas City, where, they decide, like, oh, let's all kind of team up together, and it reminds you of the characters, um in John Steinbeck's novel, where you have these two main characters coming into this farm and working on the farm and saving up enough money to start their own plot of land and live off the land, and then one of the other older kind of sort of veteran hands kind of is like, oh, can I come in on this and do this? And then ultimately in the end, one of the characters has to shoot the other in a form of mercy, but at the same time it's like, well, the dream is gone after this. So like it is disheartening. And um yeah, you're kind of again, like, we talked about this with the Ant-Man review. It's like, I don't know if I would call The Last of Us entertaining. I don't think that's the right
Yeah.
word for a show like this, even though it is very well made, engaging, and thoughtful, and again, considering characters over plot. But with this, it's just like, you do wonder, like, what category do you put this in terms of how you watch something like this? It's like, it's not, disposable entertainment. It's not meant to be fun per se. I mean, there are action sequences and suspense and moments that are thrilling, but when you get a sequence like this, or even in episode 3, you begin to wonder, how do you categorize this form of input, and what you're watching. And this comes up, I think, a lot when, like, even you're watching, a war movie that's based
Yeah,
on, like, a
any
true
drama or
story.
dark
Yeah.
drama, like, stuff like that, like, I get, like, it's just how you want you utilize filmmaking, television, movies, books, for different reasons, right? Sometimes it's escapism, sometimes it's entertainment, sometimes it's just like I don't it's hard for me to even say why I love this story and the game so much, because it is such a downer at times, but it is hopeful at moments too, and I think it's fulfilling. I guess that's it, right? Like, I think the storylines and the characters are rich and engrossing, and even though the endings of these episodes tend to be downers and things like that, but I am glad for the time I spent with Henry and Sam and learned about their story and how Henry cared about Sam, and how, again, once you see the full thing of how it fuels Joel's story and Ellie's story and things like that, and how it all comes together. It's not necessarily fun, like you said. I mean, the game is supposed to be fun because there's gameplay and things like that. It's supposed to be
Well,
entertaining and
there's an interactive
engaging.
quality to it, right?
Yeah, but when you're watching it, it is like, why do you watch it? Yeah, like, a very horrific, war movie, or just a disturbing horror movie, or something like that. Like,
Especially with television, I think, as well,
yeah,
right? Like, television, there's a thing where I think television is kind of a place where it's supposed to kind of be, you know, disposable entertainment to a certain extent, and then also you're watching something that is supposed to take your mind off of other things.
sure,
Where The Last of Us and even Chernobyl, you watch those shows,
yeah.
and they are so well made and so well written, and the characters are incredible, and everything is engaging, but at the same time, like, you walk away from it and you're not feeling good. You're not feeling like, you feel appreciative that this is
You
being
feel
made.
something, but that's, I think,
Yeah.
maybe it, right? Like, is you definitely, there's emotion in the show, and you definitely feel something as you're watching it because it's so well made and you care about the characters. But yeah, it's not necessarily like Sunday nights can't, like, I know people can't wait for the next episode because I think it's great storytelling and great and very, very well made. But it's not necessarily like, people said, like, right before this was White Lotus, right? And sure, it has some darker stuff in it, and it's about sex and relationships and stuff like that. But it is kind of that sexy, kind of pulpy, kind of fun thing of it, even though it involves murder and a bunch of shitty rich people. But like, you kind of got excited to watch that each week because it had comedic elements and things like that. And the theme song was fun and upbeat. And then you come to their next show. And I guess Game of Thrones is a bit like that too, where like nothing good happens. It's just like, for some reason, you just want to watch these people go through horrible things each week, and you can't put your finger on why, but it's very well done. So you're just like, you want to know what happens and you want to cheer for the characters, or you want something good to happen to them or something good to I don't know, but yeah, it's definitely not like feel good TV every Sunday. It's like, all right, ready to be depressed? Let's go watch an hour of The Last of Us this Sunday. So, ultimately, I think it's worth it for someone who's played the game. And part two is even more brutal. So, like, it's just uh, and even probably more depressing, but like it's just I don't know what's so compelling about it, but I think when you envision yourself in this world and what you would do, and like talked about, like putting yourself in these characters shoes and talking about how would you do, like, go through a situation, is this person a good guy or a bad guy, what is the right thing to do, like those conversations I think are so interesting and compelling. That's what I think people, why this show is as popular as it is. And I can't believe how popular it is, like where it's being referenced, how many people are watching it. Like it's I never even thought it would be as big as it is. Cause HBO shows, yes, they have their flagship stuff, but this is up there with Game of Thrones of being their most popular thing ever, right? And I guess I shouldn't be
Sopranos
surprised.
and things like that as well,
Yeah,
right?
the game was very popular, sold millions of copies, but um it's just I never it again, it goes back to me, gaming is still, it's this gigantic thing, but still feels weirdly niche. So when you see Last of Us on billboards and people talking about The Last of Us that I would never thought I'd hear talk about The Last of Us, right? And that's no offense to those people. It's just like it was this horror drama video game that I played that was, yes, very popular with gamers, but like hearing my mom every week message me about Last of Us, which is something I always wanted. Hearing you get so into it. My wife Nevis gets so into it, who's heard me talk about it week after week for 10 years, basically. And then just other people, coworkers or friends, or just people on Twitter that like didn't even know this thing existed before the TV show, and now are like reacting to it every Sunday night in the same way I played it 10 years ago is amazing. So, yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know. It's
it's
depressing as hell
appointment
sometimes, but
television,
yeah.
but it's such a weird thing where like it leaves you so
Broken.
melancholy, depressed. Like
Yeah.
it's such a and not that like those feelings shouldn't be embraced, or the
Yeah.
narrative isn't. It's telling the story it's supposed to, and it's not trying to make it anything more accessible and trying to be upbeat or what have you. And there's a lot of
No,
great
this is a bleak world that they live in.
films and television, but it's just an interesting sort of conversation to have. And like, what category of, you know, viewing do you watch something like this again, especially for television, where a lot of TV, even something you mentioned, Game of Thrones, even something like The Sopranos, where you're kind of living, or White Lotus, you're living
Sure.
vicariously through the characters and indulging in
Yeah.
sort of the things that you
The
know are
pulpiness
wrong,
or the yeah, but you
but
kind
it's
of want to
kind of
see the people do them.
fun to do so. There's
Yeah.
nothing that you want to indulge in and live
No.
vicariously through in this, other than maybe
Yeah.
eating the Chef Boyardee. It's like you're watching this thing and you're kind of like, oh, I am so happy that this is not where we are right now, but I'm also really nervous that we could be coming
Yeah.
to this kind of situation given where we are with global warming and things like that, and not necessarily a fungal outbreak, but just something that
UFO
will,
sightings
yeah,
and
Canadian UFO
plastic
sightings.
plastic factories blowing up and train,
Yeah.
it's weird. Anyways, thank you all for listening or watching, especially if you did this right away, right before the newest episode of The Last of Us, because it is
Or
a
at all.
super Sunday. Yeah, or
Because
at all.
this episode has
Um
been so delayed, right, that I feel like a
it
lot of
has.
people
So
have
we
probably
we do
listened or
appreciate it. Maybe
watched
you'll skip
other.
this one,
Yeah.
but if you did listen or watch, we really do appreciate it. If you are listening to this, episode 6 should be up, or should be up very, very soon, depending on when you're listening to it. It'll be up at our normal time, which is Sundays, 10 p.m. Eastern, right after the newest episode of The Last of Us. This is just because of vacations and different health things, we had to kind of push this episode. So we're giving you a double episode on Sunday. But then we'll be back every Sunday, like I said, 10 p.m. Eastern, right after the newest episode of The Last of Us. So that begins again with episode 6, Kin, which is tonight, February 19th, if you're listening to this right away. And if you are, thank you. You're the best. One-stop shop for everything. Head over to Untitled underscore movies on Letterboxd. We do two other shows called the Untitled Movie Podcast and Untitled Movie Reviews. We have an Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantum Mania review up on Untitled Movie Reviews, spoiler free if you wanted to go check that out. Our newest episode of the Untitled Movie Podcast, we talked about a whole bunch of stuff, including all the Super Bowl trailers and different things. So go check that out as well. But as always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at untitledmoviepodcast.com, and follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Eric Marchin. You can find more of my video reviews on rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on all the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
Click, click, boom!